Get up! Karen Foster's voice sliced through first class like a blade. She didn't ask. She didn't wait. She grabbed the armrest of seat 1A and leaned into the face of a 19-year-old black kid in a hoodie and Nike sneakers. I don't know how you got past the gate, but this seat isn't yours. Move. Now. Every passenger in the cabin turned to watch. Not one of them said a word. The boy looked up at her boarding pass still in his hand and said nothing. Karen smiled. She thought she'd already won. She had no idea that in less than 3 hours she would be escorted off this aircraft in handcuffs, and the boy sitting in 1A would be the reason her career ended tonight. If you want to see how this satisfying story unfolds, subscribe to our channel, follow along to the very end, and comment the city you're watching from so we can see just how far this story travels. Eli Moore had not slept in 4 days. He sat in the back of a black town car somewhere on the highway between Princeton and Newark Liberty International, his forehead pressed against the cold window, watching the New Jersey landscape blur past in the gray morning light. His phone had not stopped buzzing since Tuesday. 4 days ago, his father, Marcus Moore, had collapsed in the boardroom of Global Skyway's headquarters during a quarterly earnings call. Massive heart attack. Dead before the paramedics arrived. Eli had been in the middle of a statistics exam when Sarah Jenkins called him. He remembered dropping his pencil. He remembered walking out of the exam hall without saying a word to anyone. He remembered sitting on a bench outside the mathematics building for 45 minutes, staring at a crack in the sidewalk, unable to process the words Sarah had just said to him.
Your father is gone, Eli. I'm so sorry.
Marcus Moore was not just a man. He was an institution. He had founded Global Skyways 26 years ago with a single leased aircraft and a vision that commercial aviation could be better, fairer, more human. He had built it into the 4th largest airline in the world. He had done it as a black man in an industry that had never wanted him. He had fought every inch of the way, and now he was gone, and the entire weight of that empire had fallen onto the shoulders of a 19-year-old kid who had never even sat in a boardroom. Sarah Jenkins had handled most of the immediate aftermath. She was the COO Marcus's right hand for 15 years, and she had kept the company running while Eli buried his father. But now there was a crisis. The London office was in turmoil. 3 senior executives had resigned within 48 hours of Marcus's death, and there were rumors that a hostile takeover bid was being assembled by Orion Aviation, Global Skyway's biggest competitor. Sarah had called Eli last night and told him the truth. Eli, I can hold things together for another week, maybe 2, but the board needs to see you. The London team needs to see you. If you don't show up, Orion is going to smell blood in the water, and everything your father built is going to be on the table. Eli had said yes. He didn't know what else to say. He packed a single carry-on bag, put on the cleanest hoodie he could find, and called a car to the airport. Now he was standing at the check-in counter at Newark Liberty Terminal B, holding a first-class ticket on Global Skyway's Flight 110 nonstop to London Heathrow. The woman behind the counter smiled at him, politely handed him his boarding pass, and wished him a pleasant flight. Eli thanked her and walked toward security, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. He felt like a fraud. He had flown first class before, of course. His father had insisted on it whenever they traveled together. But Marcus had always been beside him, tall and commanding, wearing one of his tailored suits, filling every room he entered with the quiet authority that came from decades of earning respect the hard way. Without his father, Eli felt exposed. He was just a kid in a hoodie. He looked like he belonged in the back of the plane, and he knew it, and the knowing made his stomach tighten with something that sat halfway between shame and anger. The gate area was already busy when Eli arrived. Business travelers in dark suits, a woman in a cream-colored blazer typing furiously on her laptop, an older man with silver hair reading the Financial Times. Eli found a seat near the window and pulled his hood up, trying to disappear. His phone buzzed again, a text from Sarah. Board meeting scheduled for Thursday, 9 a.m. London time. I'll have a briefing packet waiting at the hotel. You're going to be fine. Eli stared at the message for a long time. He wanted to believe her. He wasn't sure he did. When the boarding announcement came, Eli stood and joined the first-class line. The gate agent scanned his pass without issue. He walked down the jet bridge and stepped onto the aircraft, turning left toward the first-class cabin. The cabin was immaculate. Wide leather seats arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration. Soft lighting, the smell of fresh coffee and warm towels. Eli found seat 1A and sat down. He stuffed his carry-on under the seat in front of him, put his phone in his lap, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 4 days. For a moment, just one moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes. That moment lasted exactly 11 seconds. "Excuse me." Eli opened his eyes. A woman was standing over him. She was tall, blonde, mid-40s, wearing the navy blue uniform of a Global Skyways flight attendant. Her name tag read Karen Foster. Her lips were pressed into a thin, hard line, and her eyes moved over Eli with the kind of slow, deliberate assessment that made his skin prickle. "Can I help you?" Eli said. Karen tilted her head. "I think there's been a mistake with your seat assignment." Eli looked down at his boarding pass, then back at her. "It says 1A. "I can see what it says." Karen's voice dropped half a degree. "But I need to verify your booking. Sometimes the system makes errors." The gate agent scanned it. It went through fine. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the seat while I sort this out." She said the word "sir" the way some people say it when they mean the opposite. Eli felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "I'd rather not. I'm comfortable." Karen's eyes narrowed. She glanced over her shoulder toward the galley, then back at Eli. "I'm asking you politely. And I'm telling you politely that I'm in my assigned seat." A man across the aisle, mid-50s, gray suit, gold watch, looked up from his newspaper. He was watching now. So was the woman in 2C. Eli could feel the attention gathering around him like static before a storm. Karen leaned closer. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the edge in it was sharp enough to cut glass. "Look, I don't know who booked this ticket for you, but first class has a certain standard. I'm sure you understand." Eli understood perfectly. He understood what she was really saying. He understood the way her eyes kept moving to his hoodie, his sneakers, the color of his skin. He had seen this look before 100 times in 100 different places. The look that said, "You don't belong here." "My name is Eli Moore," he said quietly. "I purchased this ticket. I am sitting in my assigned seat. I am not moving." Karen straightened up. Something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of surprise that someone had pushed back, followed immediately by something harder. "Fine," she said. "I'll need to speak with the captain about this." She turned and walked toward the cockpit, her heels clicking against the cabin floor with the precision of a metronome. Eli watched her go. His hands were shaking, but he folded them in his lap so no one could see. The man in the gray suit across the aisle folded his newspaper. "She's something, isn't she?" he said, and there was a knowing look in his eyes that told Eli this man had seen what just happened and understood exactly what it was. "Yeah," Eli said, "she's something." 3 minutes passed, then 5. Eli sat in his seat staring straight ahead, willing his heartbeat to slow down. He thought about his father. Marcus Moore had dealt with people like Karen Foster his entire career, people who looked at the color of his skin and decided before he ever opened his mouth that he didn't deserve to be where he was. Marcus had never flinched. He had never raised his voice. He had simply kept going, kept building, kept winning, until the doubters had nothing left to say. Eli wanted to be like that. He wasn't sure he was. The cockpit door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, early 60s with a thick gray mustache and the 4 gold stripes of a captain on his epaulets. Captain Michael Harrison, 32 years with Global Skyways. He walked through the first-class cabin with the slow, heavy confidence of a man who believed he owned every room he entered. Karen was right behind him, and the look on her face was triumphant. Captain Harrison stopped at row 1 and looked down at Eli. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask a question. He simply looked the way a man looks at something that has appeared where it shouldn't be. "You the kid in 1A," Harrison said. "I'm the passenger in 1A," Eli corrected. Harrison's mustache twitched. "Son, I've been flying this route for 18 years. I know every type of person who sits in this cabin, and I can tell you right now, there's been some kind of mix-up." "There hasn't been a mix-up." "Let me see your boarding pass." Eli held it up. Harrison took it, examined it for a long time, then handed it back. His expression didn't change. "Boarding pass looks right," Harrison said, and for one brief moment Eli thought it was over. Then Harrison added, "But that doesn't mean anything. System glitches happen all the time. I'm going to have to ask you to relocate to economy until we can sort this out." "No." The word came out harder than Eli intended, harder than he expected. It came from somewhere deep in his chest, from the place where 4 days of grief and exhaustion and rage had been compressing into something dense and volatile. Harrison blinked. "Excuse me." "I said no, I'm not moving. This is my seat. I paid for this seat. I have documentation confirming this seat. And I'm not going to be relocated because you and your flight attendant have decided I don't look like I belong here." The cabin was completely silent now. Every passenger in first class was watching. The woman in 2C had put down her phone. The man in the gray suit had abandoned his newspaper entirely. A couple in row 3 had turned around in their seats. Harrison's face reddened. He leaned down, bringing his face close to Eli's. "Now listen to me, kid. I am the captain of this aircraft. My word is law on this plane. If I tell you to move, you move. That's not a request. That's an order." Eli looked directly into Harrison's eyes. "Then I suggest you document this interaction carefully, Captain, because what you're doing right now has a name and it's not going to look good in a report." Harrison straightened up slowly. His jaw was working, grinding back and forth, and Eli could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Harrison was used to compliance. He was used to people folding when he raised his voice. He was not used to a 19-year-old kid staring him down in front of a cabin full of witnesses. "Karen," Harrison said without looking at her, "get this sorted. I want this passenger moved before we push back." "Yes, Captain," Karen said, and there was a glow of satisfaction in her voice that made Eli's stomach turn. Harrison walked back toward the cockpit. Karen turned to Eli with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You heard the captain. I'm going to need you to gather your things." "I'm not gathering anything." "Sir, if you refuse to comply with a crew member's instructions, we can have you removed from this aircraft." "Then remove me, and I'll have my attorney on the phone before your security team reaches the gate." Karen's smile wavered. "You have an attorney?" "I have several." Something in Eli's voice made Karen pause. She studied him again this time with less certainty, but the pause lasted only a moment before her face hardened again. "I don't care how many attorneys you have. You're not staying in this seat." Eli pulled out his phone. "I'm going to make a call now. I'd appreciate some privacy." Karen stood there for a moment, caught between authority and uncertainty, then turned sharply and walked back toward the galley. Eli watched her go, then looked down at his phone. His hands were still shaking. He scrolled to Sarah Jenkins's contact and pressed call. Sarah picked up on the first ring. "Eli, is everything okay? Are you on the plane?" "I'm on the plane. Listen, I have a situation." He kept his voice low. "The flight attendant and the captain are trying to move me out of first class. They're claiming there's a system error, but that's not what this is." Sarah was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The warm maternal tone was gone. In its place was the voice of a woman who had spent 15 years navigating corporate warfare at the highest level. "What are their names?" "Flight attendant is Karen Foster. Captain is Michael Harrison." "I'm pulling up the crew manifest now." Eli heard rapid typing. "Karen Foster, senior flight attendant, 12 years with the company. Michael Harrison, captain, 32 years. Eli, listen to me carefully. Do not leave that seat. Do not raise your voice. Do not give them anything they can use against you. I'm going to make some calls." "Sarah, I don't want to make this into a thing. I just want to fly to London." "It's already a thing, Eli. They made it a thing when they decided to target a passenger based on how he looks. This is exactly the kind of behavior your father spent his career fighting against. Sit tight. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. The line went dead. Eli put his phone down and stared at the seat back in front of him. His father's face appeared in his mind clear and vivid, the way Marcus used to look when someone tried to push him around. That calm, unshakable expression. That refusal to bend. "I'm trying, Dad," Eli thought. "I'm trying." A voice came from across the aisle. The man in the gray suit was leaning toward him. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said. "For what it's worth, I think you're handling this exactly right." Eli looked at him. "Thanks." My name's Richard. Richard Park. I fly this route every month. I've never seen anything like what just happened. That flight attendant has always been difficult, but this was something else entirely. You've dealt with her before? Everyone in first class has dealt with her. She has a way of deciding who belongs and who doesn't. Richard paused. Usually she's more subtle about it. Today she wasn't. Maybe she thought she didn't need to be subtle with me. Richard met Eli's eyes and nodded slowly. Maybe she did. Eli turned back to his phone. He opened his email and scrolled through the messages that had been piling up since his father's death. Board communications, condolence letters from industry leaders, a message from Orion Aviation's CEO that was thinly disguised as sympathy, but was really a probe testing whether Global Skyways was vulnerable. Eli read it twice, then archived it without responding. 8 minutes later, Karen Foster reappeared. This time she wasn't alone. A younger flight attendant, a woman named Diane, was trailing behind her, looking uncomfortable. Karen stopped at Eli's row and crossed her arms. "Last chance," Karen said. "We're about to close the doors. If you don't move voluntarily, I'm calling the gate agent to have you escorted off." Eli looked at her. "Call them." "You think I won't? I think you will. And I think it will be the worst decision you've made this year." Karen's jaw tightened. She turned to Diane. "Get the gate agent." Diane hesitated. "Karen, maybe we should just let it go. His boarding pass is valid. The system shows the booking is confirmed." "I didn't ask for your opinion, Diane. Get the gate agent." "Karen, I checked it myself. His ticket is paid in full. First class, seat 1A. There's no error." "I said get the gate agent." Diane looked at Eli, then back at Karen. Something passed across her face, a mix of guilt and resolve. "No," Diane said quietly. "I'm not going to do that." Karen's head snapped toward Diane so fast it was almost violent. "What did you just say to me?" "I said no. He has a valid ticket. He has a valid seat assignment. I'm not going to help you remove a paying passenger because you don't like the way he's dressed." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard Park across the aisle leaned back in his seat with the faintest hint of a smile on his face. The couple in row 3 exchanged a look. The woman in 2C was holding her phone at an angle that suggested she might be recording. Karen's face went through several colors in quick succession, red, then white, then a mottled pink that settled along her jawline. She pointed a trembling finger at Diane. "You and I will be having a conversation after this flight." "Looking forward to it," Diane said, and walked back toward the galley. Karen stood alone in the aisle for a moment, exposed and furious. Then she turned to Eli one last time. "This isn't over," she said. "No," Eli agreed. "It isn't." Karen disappeared into the forward galley. The cabin doors closed. The aircraft began to push back from the gate. Eli felt the gentle lurch as the tow bar engaged, and he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Made contact with the head of in-flight operations. They're aware of the situation. Do not engage further with the crew. Everything is being documented. I'll have more information for you within the hour." Eli typed back a single word. "Okay." The aircraft taxied to the runway. The engine spooled up that deep rolling thunder that Eli had heard 1,000 times, and the plane surged forward, pressing him back into his seat. The wheels left the ground, and Newark fell away beneath them, and Eli Moore, 19 years old, orphaned, terrified, and sitting in the seat his father had earned for him, rose into the sky. 30,000 feet below the world his father had built was waiting for him, and 30 feet behind him in the forward galley, Karen Foster was already making phone calls of her own. The seatbelt sign had barely flickered off when Karen Foster walked back into the first-class cabin, carrying a tray of warm towels. She distributed them with mechanical precision, moving from row to row, offering each passenger a smile calibrated to suggest warmth without sincerity. When she reached Eli's row, she skipped him entirely. She placed a towel on Richard Park's tray table across the aisle, then turned and walked past 1A as though the seat were empty. Richard looked at Eli. Eli shook his head slightly. "Don't." Richard ignored him. "Excuse me?" he called after Karen. "I think you missed someone." Karen stopped. She turned slowly. "I'm sorry. The gentleman in 1A. You skipped him." Karen's eyes moved to Eli, then back to Richard. I'll get to him in a moment. I'm working through the cabin in order. You were working through the cabin in order. You went from 1B to 2A. You skipped 1A. Karen's smile tightened until it barely qualified as a smile at all. Sir, I assure you every passenger will be attended to. There's no need to concern yourself. She walked away before Richard could respond. He turned to Eli with a look of quiet disbelief. She's not even trying to hide it. She doesn't think she needs to, Eli said. Eli pulled out his phone and opened the text thread with Sarah Jenkins. He typed quickly, "They're freezing me out. No service, no acknowledgement." The captain backed her up before takeoff. "This is coordinated." Sarah's response came in under a minute. "Document everything. Times, names, specific actions. I'm building a file. Also, I need you to know something. I ran a background check on Captain Harrison. He has 2 prior complaints in the system, both from passengers of color, both dismissed by his regional supervisor. This isn't the first time." Eli read the message twice. His jaw tightened. 2 prior complaints, dismissed. His father had built this airline from nothing, had poured his entire life into creating something better, and this was happening on one of his planes. The irony was so sharp it almost made him laugh. Almost. Diane appeared at his row a few minutes later. She was carrying a glass of water and a menu. She set both down on his tray table without ceremony, but with a steadiness that communicated something words didn't. "I'm sorry about earlier," she said quietly. "Can I get you anything else?" "This is fine, thank you, Diane." She nodded and started to turn away, then stopped. She glanced toward the galley, checking that Karen wasn't watching. "You should know," she said barely above a whisper. "She's been talking to the captain on the intercom. I don't know what they're planning, but she's not letting this go." "What do you mean planning?" "I heard her say something about calling the air marshal, saying you were being disruptive." Eli's blood went cold. "I haven't been disruptive. I've been sitting in my seat for the last 40 minutes. I know that. You know that. But if the captain backs her story, it becomes his word against yours at 35,000 feet. And up here, the captain's word is the only one that matters." Eli stared at her. "Why are you telling me this?" Diane held his gaze for a moment. "Because my mother is black, and I've watched her get treated like this my entire life, and I'm tired of watching." She walked away before Eli could respond. He sat there, the glass of water untouched on his tray table, processing what she had just told him. An air marshal. They were going to claim he was disruptive. They were going to fabricate a security incident to justify removing him, or worse, to justify having him detained when they landed. The thought sent a spike of adrenaline through his chest so sharp it made his vision blur for half a second. He picked up his phone and called Sarah. She answered immediately. "What happened?" "They're going to call the air marshal on me. They're going to say I'm being disruptive." Sarah was quiet for 1 beat, 2 beats. "Are you sure?" "One of the other flight attendants just warned me. She overheard Karen talking to the captain on the intercom." "Eli, listen to me. Do not do anything. Do not stand up. Do not raise your voice. Do not engage with any crew member unless they directly address you. If the air marshal approaches you, be completely cooperative. Hands visible at all times. Short answers. Yes, sir. No, sir. Do you understand?" "Sarah, I haven't done anything wrong." "I know you haven't. That's exactly why we're going to win this. But right now, right this second, you are a young black man on an aircraft where the captain has decided you're a problem. The rules are not fair. The situation is not fair. And I need you to survive it before we can fix it. Do you understand me?" Eli closed his eyes. His father's voice echoed somewhere in the back of his mind. "The world doesn't care what you deserve, Eli. It cares what you can prove." "I understand," Eli said. "Good. I'm calling our general counsel right now. I'm also calling the head of flight operations in London. By the time that plane lands, there will be a legal team waiting at the gate. Whatever they try to do to you, it ends the moment those wheels touch the ground." Sarah hung up. Eli put his phone down and folded his hands in his lap. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips. He thought about standing up and walking to the back of the plane, finding a seat in economy, disappearing into the crowd where no one would look twice at a kid in a hoodie. It would be easier. It would make everything stop. But his father hadn't built an empire by choosing what was easy. Eli stayed in his seat. 20 minutes passed. The first-class cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of a transatlantic flight. Passengers read slept-tapped on laptops. Richard Park ordered a scotch and opened a leather-bound journal. The couple in row 3 watched a movie on the shared screen between their seats. Everything appeared normal. Then Captain Harrison's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to apologize for a brief security procedure we'll be conducting in the cabin shortly. This is purely precautionary and nothing to be concerned about. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your cooperation." Eli's stomach dropped. He looked across the aisle at Richard, who had lowered his scotch glass and was staring at the intercom speaker with narrowed eyes. "Security procedure," Richard repeated quietly. He looked at Eli. "You think this is about you? I know it's about me." Richard set his glass down. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a business card. He placed it on Eli's tray table. Eli looked down at it. Richard Park, senior partner, Morrison and Associates, civil rights litigation. "Whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, Richard said, "I'm a witness, and I'm a damn good lawyer." Before Eli could respond, a man emerged from behind the curtain separating first class from business. He was tall, black, mid-30s, wearing a plain navy blazer and khaki pants. No uniform, no badge visible. But the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the cabin before settling on row 1, told Eli everything he needed to know. The air marshal stopped at Eli's row. He didn't sit down. He stood in the aisle and looked at Eli the way a doctor looks at an X-ray professionally without judgment, reading the situation before he committed to a diagnosis. "Sir, I'm Federal Air Marshal David Washington. I've been asked by the captain to check on a situation in the cabin. Mind if I sit down?" Eli gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Please." Washington sat. He was quiet for a moment, settling in, letting the tension in the air thin out just slightly before he spoke again. "Captain tells me there's been a disturbance. Says a passenger has been confrontational with the crew and refused to comply with seating instructions." Washington paused. "That passenger would be you." "That's what they're saying. It's not what happened." "Tell me what happened." Eli told him. All of it. The boarding pass, Karen's assumption that he didn't belong, the captain's order to move to economy, Diane's refusal to participate, the service being withheld, the warning about the air marshal call. He kept his voice low and even the way Sarah had told him to, and he watched Washington's face as he spoke. Washington listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change not once, but something shifted in his eyes as Eli talked. A recognition, a familiarity, the look of a man who had heard this story before, maybe not these exact words, but this exact story, and knew exactly what it was. When Eli finished, Washington was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do you have your boarding pass?" Eli handed it to him. Washington examined it, nodded, and handed it back. "Mr. Moore, I'm going to be straight with you. I've been on this flight since Newark. I've been sitting in row 12 since before you boarded. I watched you board. I watched you sit down. I watched the flight attendant approach you. And I watched the captain come out of the cockpit and order you to move." He paused. "You haven't been confrontational. You haven't been disruptive. You've been sitting in your assigned seat doing absolutely nothing wrong." Eli felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, releasing. "Then why did they call you?" Eli asked. "Because that's what people do when they've decided someone doesn't belong and that someone won't leave quietly. They escalate. They bring in authority. They hope the authority doesn't ask too many questions." Washington leaned back in his seat. "I ask questions, Mr. Moore. It's my job. Richard Park, who had been listening from across the aisle, spoke up. "Marshal Washington, my name is Richard Park. I'm an attorney. I've witnessed the entire interaction between this passenger and the flight crew. Everything he's told you is accurate. I'm prepared to provide a statement." Washington looked at Richard, then back at Eli. "You've got a lawyer already. That was fast." "He was sitting across the aisle," Eli said. "Sometimes the universe puts people where they need to be." Washington almost smiled. Almost. "All right, Mr. Moore. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go talk to the captain. I'm going to explain to him that I've assessed the situation and there is no security concern in this cabin. And then I'm going to go back to my seat in row 12 and finish my book. That's it. That's it. You're a passenger on this aircraft with a valid ticket and a valid seat assignment. You have every right to be exactly where you are. Anyone who tells you different is wrong, and I don't work for wrong." Washington stood. He straightened his blazer. Then he leaned down and said very quietly, so only Eli could hear, "My father was a pilot, flew cargo planes for 30 years. He never made it past first officer because the guys who looked like Captain Harrison never signed off on his promotions. He died at 62, still flying right seat. So when I say I know what this is, Mr. Moore, I need you to understand that I know what this is." He walked toward the cockpit without looking back. Eli sat perfectly still. His eyes were burning, but he didn't blink. He would not cry. Not here, not now. He pressed his thumbnail into the pad of his index finger, using the small pane to anchor himself, and breathed. Richard Park raised his scotch glass slightly. "Hell of a thing," he said. "Yeah," Eli said. "Hell of a thing." 5 minutes later, the cockpit door opened again. This time it wasn't Washington who emerged. It was Captain Harrison, and his face was the color of old brick. Harrison walked directly to Eli's row. He stood in the aisle, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that was meant to convey authority, but instead communicated something closer to barely controlled fury. "The Marshal has informed me that he sees no security concern," Harrison said. His voice was flat, pressed thin, like words being squeezed through a closed fist. "Good," Eli said. "However," Harrison let the word hang in the air, "I want to be clear. I am still the captain of this aircraft. I am still responsible for the safety and security of every person on board. And if at any point I determine that your presence in this cabin constitutes a disruption, I will not hesitate to take action." "Are you threatening me, Captain?" "I'm informing you of the chain of command. The chain of command that just told you there's no problem here." Harrison's left eye twitched. It was a small movement, involuntary, but Eli caught it, and he knew that Harrison knew he caught it. The power in this conversation had shifted, and both of them could feel it. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Moore," Harrison said, and the way he said Eli's name made it sound like something he'd scraped off the bottom of his shoe. Harrison turned and walked back to the cockpit. The door closed behind him with a metallic click that echoed through the silent cabin. Karen Foster appeared moments later. She had been watching from the galley entrance, and whatever she had expected Harrison's conversation with the air marshal to produce, this wasn't it. She stood in the aisle for a moment, her eyes moving between the closed cockpit door and Eli's seat, her mind visibly recalculating. Then she did something Eli didn't expect. She walked to his row, placed a warm towel on his tray table, and said, "Can I get you a drink, sir?" Her voice was different now. Not warm, not apologetic, professional. The voice of a woman who had just realized she might be in trouble and was now covering her tracks. "Water is fine," Eli said. "Still or sparkling?" "Still." Karen nodded and retreated to the galley. Eli looked at the warm towel on his tray table. He didn't touch it. He didn't want anything from her. Richard noticed. "She's backpedaling." "Too late," Eli said. His phone buzzed. Sarah again. "Eli, I need you to read this carefully. I just got off the phone with Gerald Torres, our general counsel. Here's what you need to know. Your father updated his will 3 weeks before he died. The original plan was for the board to appoint an interim CEO until you turn 25. Your father changed it. The new will gives you full executive authority immediately. Full voting control of all shares. Chairman, CEO, everything. Gerald says your father told him, and this is a direct quote, 'If something happens to me, my son takes over. Not in 6 years. Now. He's ready even if he doesn't know it yet.'" Eli read the message 3 times. His vision blurred, and this time it wasn't adrenaline. It was grief, sudden and overwhelming, crashing over him like a wave he hadn't seen coming. His father had believed in him, not someday, not eventually, now. 3 weeks before he died, Marcus Moore had looked at his 19-year-old son and decided that he was ready to lead an empire. Eli pressed his phone against his chest and closed his eyes. The engines hummed around him. The cabin was quiet. And somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic, 20,000 feet above an ocean his father had crossed 100 times, Eli Moore made a decision. He was done being afraid. He was done apologizing for taking up space. He was done letting people like Karen Foster and Captain Michael Harrison define where he belonged. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Sarah. 2 sentences. No hesitation. File a formal complaint against Captain Michael Harrison and Senior Flight Attendant Karen Foster, and schedule a press conference for Friday morning in London. Sarah's response came back in 4 words. Already on it, boss. Eli put his phone down. He picked up the warm towel Karen had left on his tray table. He unfolded it, pressed it against his face, and breathed in the heat. Then he set it down, opened the menu Diane had brought him earlier, and ordered dinner. For the first time in 4 days, he was hungry. Across the aisle, Richard Park had closed his journal and was watching Eli with the quiet attention of a man who recognized something he had seen before. Not the grief, not the anger, something else, something steadier. "You doing all right?" Richard asked. Eli looked at him. "I'm doing better." "Good, because I have a feeling this flight is going to get a lot more interesting before we land." Eli almost smiled. "You have no idea." In the forward galley, Karen Foster stood with her back against the beverage cart, her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking in a low, rapid voice to someone on the ground, someone she trusted, someone who had always taken her side before. She was explaining what had happened, reshaping the story, smoothing the edges, making herself the victim and the boy in 1A the aggressor. She had no way of knowing that the boy in 1A owned the plane she was standing in the airline she worked for, and the ground beneath the building where she collected her paycheck every 2 weeks. She had no way of knowing that the next 48 hours would dismantle everything she had spent 12 years building. And she had no way of knowing that the call she was making right now was being logged, time-stamped, and flagged by a system her own airline had installed 3 months ago, a system designed by Marcus Moore himself to identify and track exactly this kind of behavior. The system was called Project Lighthouse. Eli ate slowly. He cut his steak into small, deliberate pieces and chewed each one with the kind of focus that only comes from a mind trying to hold itself together. Across the aisle, Richard Park had fallen asleep with his journal open on his chest, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. The cabin had grown dim, most passengers surrendering to the artificial night that transatlantic flights impose somewhere over the middle of the ocean. But Eli was wide awake. His phone buzzed. Sarah again. Eli Project Lighthouse flagged something. Karen Foster made a personal call from the galley phone 14 minutes ago. The call lasted 6 minutes and 22 seconds. She contacted Derek Holloway, Regional Director of In-Flight Operations Atlantic Division. He's her direct supervisor. We have the call log, but not the content. However, Derek Holloway just made a call of his own. To the airline's PR crisis team, at 2 in the morning London time. Eli set his fork down. He read the message again, then typed back. Why would her supervisor call the PR crisis team? Sarah's reply took less than 30 seconds. Because he's not trying to help you, Eli. He's trying to protect her, and himself. Derek Holloway has been Karen Foster's supervisor for 9 of her 12 years with the company. If she has a pattern of discriminatory behavior, he's the one who should have caught it. Those 2 prior complaints against Captain Harrison that were dismissed, I just pulled the files. Derek Holloway was the one who dismissed them. Eli stared at his phone. The steak on his plate was getting cold. He didn't care. The picture was getting bigger now, wider than a single flight attendant with a bad attitude, wider than a captain with a superiority complex. This was a system, a network of people who had been covering for each other, protecting each other for years. And they had been doing it inside the airline his father built. He typed one word back to Sarah, how? Sarah's response was longer this time, and Eli could almost hear the controlled fury behind every sentence. Your father suspected it. That's why he created Project Lighthouse. 3 months ago, he hired an outside consulting firm to design an internal monitoring system for crew behavior complaints. The system tracks complaints, cross-references them with crew assignments, supervisor responses, and resolution outcomes. It's designed to identify patterns of discrimination that individual complaints might miss. Your father presented it to the board 2 weeks before he died. Half the board pushed back. They said it was invasive, that it would damage crew morale. Your father overruled them. He said, and I remember his exact words, I didn't build this airline so my employees could treat people the way the world treated me. Eli's throat closed. He pressed his thumb hard against the edge of his tray table, using the pressure to keep himself anchored. His father had known. His father had seen what was happening inside his own company, and he had been fighting it quietly, methodically, the way he fought everything. And then he died before the fight was finished. Now it was Eli's fight. He picked up his phone and called Sarah. She answered before the first ring finished. "Talk to me," she said. "I want everything Project Lighthouse has on Karen Foster, Captain Harrison, and Derek Holloway. Every complaint, every resolution, every personnel file. I want it on my desk before the board meeting Thursday morning. I'll have it tonight. And Sarah, I want the names of every passenger who filed those 2 prior complaints against Harrison, the ones Holloway dismissed. Why? Because someone owes them an apology, and I'm going to deliver it personally." Sarah was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had a quality Eli had never heard from her before. It sounded almost like pride. "Your father would have done the same thing. My father would have done it sooner. Your father didn't know about Holloway's involvement until 3 weeks ago. He was still building the case. Eli, you need to understand something. What you're walking into in London isn't just a board meeting. It's a war. Holloway has allies on the board, at least 2 directors who voted against Project Lighthouse. They're going to try to use your age against you. They're going to try to table the monitoring system. And if Orion Aviation gets wind of internal turmoil, the takeover bid goes from rumor to reality. Then we make sure they don't get wind of it. How? By finishing what my father started before anyone has time to stop us." Sarah exhaled. "You sound like him, you know." "I don't feel like him." "He didn't feel like him either, Eli, not in the beginning. He told me once that the first 5 years of running this company, he woke up every morning convinced someone was going to figure out he was making it all up as he went along. He did it anyway." Eli closed his eyes. The engine noise filled his ears, steady and constant, a sound his father had loved. Marcus used to say the engines were the heartbeat of the airline. As long as they kept running, everything else could be fixed. "I'll call you when we land," Eli said. "I'll be ready." He hung up and leaned back in his seat. The cabin was quiet except for the low hum of recirculated air. Most of the lights were off. Karen Foster had not returned since delivering his water. Diane had checked on him once, silently refilling his glass without being asked, and had given him a look that communicated something that words would have made dangerous. Eli opened his laptop. He had been avoiding his email for 4 days, but avoidance was a luxury he could no longer afford. He scrolled through the messages, methodically sorting them into categories in his mind. Condolences, business, threats disguised as opportunities. One email stopped him cold. It was from Victor Ashford, CEO of Orion Aviation. The subject line read, "A conversation between friends." Eli opened it. "Dear Eli, first let me express my deepest condolences on the loss of your father. Marcus was a titan of this industry, and his absence will be felt for years to come. I'm reaching out because I believe this is a critical moment for Global Skyways. The transition of leadership is always delicate, and I want you to know that Orion stands ready to assist in any way that serves the best interests of both our companies. I'd welcome the opportunity to sit down with you in London this week to discuss how we might collaborate during this period of change. I've taken the liberty of reaching out to several members of your board to express our interest in a potential partnership. I trust you'll find their feedback encouraging. With warm regards, Victor Ashford." Eli read the email twice, then a third time. The language was careful, polished, the kind of corporate diplomacy that sounded like a handshake but functioned like a chokehold. Victor Ashford wasn't offering collaboration. He was telling Eli in the most civilized terms possible that he had already begun lobbying Global Skyways board members for a merger, which was another word for a takeover, which was another word for the erasure of everything Marcus Moore had built. "I've taken the liberty of reaching out to several members of your board." Eli's hands were steady as he typed a response. "Mr. Ashford, thank you for your condolences. My father spoke of you often. He admired your ambition, if not always your methods. I appreciate your offer of collaboration, but Global Skyways is not looking for partners at this time. We are looking for the same thing we have always looked for, a higher standard. I look forward to competing with you for years to come. Sincerely, Elias Moore, Chairman and CEO, Global Skyways." He pressed send before he could second-guess himself. Then he forwarded the original email to Sarah with a single line. "Ashford is already talking to board members. Find out which ones." Richard Park stirred across the aisle. His journal slid off his chest and he caught it reflexively blinking in the dim cabin light. He looked at Eli, who was still staring at his laptop screen, and sat up. "Can't sleep either," Richard said. "Haven't slept in 4 days. That'll catch up with you eventually." "I know, just not tonight." Richard adjusted his glasses and studied Eli for a moment. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Depends on the question. What do you do, Eli? And I don't mean what's your major. I mean, how does a 19-year-old kid afford a first-class ticket on a transatlantic flight and have multiple attorneys on speed dial?" Eli turned to look at Richard. He had spent the entire flight hiding behind his hoodie, his silence, his composure, hiding who he was because he had learned from a lifetime of watching his father that revealing power too early could be as dangerous as having none at all. But Richard Park had stood up for him. Richard Park had offered his business card and his testimony when he had no obligation to do either. Richard had earned the truth. "My father was Marcus Moore," Eli said. Richard's expression didn't change at first. Then slowly, like a photograph developing in real time, recognition moved across his face. His lips parted. His eyes widened. He looked at Eli, then at the seat, then at the cabin around them, then back at Eli. "Marcus Moore," Richard repeated. "The Marcus Moore, founder of Global Skyways." "Yes. Your father owned this airline." "He did, and now I do. And now I—" Richard sat back in his seat. He picked up his scotch glass, realized it was empty, and set it down again. "That flight attendant, the captain, they tried to kick the owner of the airline out of first class. They tried to kick a black teenager out of first class. They didn't know he was the owner. They didn't care enough to find out." Richard was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The casual camaraderie was still there, but underneath it was something harder, something professional. "Eli, I handle civil rights cases for a living. I've been doing it for 23 years. I've seen a lot of things on a lot of airplanes. I have never seen anything like what happened on this flight tonight." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that what happened to you isn't just a complaint to HR. It's a case, a significant one. You were racially profiled, harassed, denied service, and subjected to a false security report by the crew of your own airline. And you have a cabin full of witnesses, an air marshal who corroborated your account, and a monitoring system that's been logging the whole thing. I'm not looking to sue my own company, Richard. I'm not talking about suing. I'm talking about accountability. There's a difference." Richard leaned forward. "Your father built this airline. He built it on the promise that air travel could be equitable. What happened to you tonight is a betrayal of that promise. And if you let it slide, if you handle it quietly internally with a reprimand and a sensitivity training seminar, you're telling every employee in this company that the promise doesn't mean anything." Eli looked at Richard for a long time. He thought about his father's words, the ones Sarah had repeated. "I didn't build this airline so my employees could treat people the way the world treated me." "What would you recommend?" Eli asked. "Transparency. You're already planning a press conference for Friday. Make this part of it, not as a victim story, not as a gotcha moment, as a declaration of what this airline stands for and what happens when someone violates that standard. Name the behavior, name the consequences, and announce the expansion of Project Lighthouse as a permanent company-wide accountability system." "You know about Project Lighthouse?" Richard shook his head. "No. You just mentioned a monitoring system, and you have the look of someone who's about to change something big. I filled in the gaps. I'm a lawyer. It's what we do." Eli almost laughed. It was the closest he had come to laughing in 4 days, and the sound surprised him when it left his mouth. It was short and rough, more exhale than anything, but it was real, and it cracked something loose inside his chest that had been wound too tight for too long. "Richard, would you be willing to consult on this not as my personal attorney, as an advisor, someone who can help me do this the right way?" Richard picked up this empty scotch glass and turned it slowly in his hand. "I flew to London tonight to meet with a client who's paying me $600 an hour to review a discrimination settlement," he said. "What you're describing is bigger than any case I've ever worked on. It's systemic reform inside a major international airline led by a 19-year-old who just inherited the company 4 days ago." He set the glass down. "I'd be honored." They shook hands across the aisle. Eli's grip was firm, steadier than he expected. Richard held it for a moment longer than necessary, and Eli understood that something had just shifted. He was no longer alone on this flight. He had Sarah Jenkins building the case on the ground. He had Diane watching his back in the cabin. He had David Washington, the air marshal, who had looked at the situation and chosen truth over convenience. And now he had Richard Park, a civil rights attorney with 23 years of experience, sitting 3 feet away and ready to fight. The cockpit door opened. Captain Harrison stepped out. He was not alone. Behind him was a man Eli had never seen before. A stocky, red-faced man in his 50s, wearing a Global Skyways ground crew uniform with a supervisor badge clipped to his belt. The man looked like he had been awakened from a deep sleep and was not happy about it. Harrison walked through the first-class cabin without looking at anyone. The man behind him followed his eyes, scanning the rows until they landed on Eli. "Mr. Moore," the man said. Eli looked at him. "Yes." "My name is Thomas Burke. I'm the London station manager for Global Skyways. I've been patched into this flight by Captain Harrison to address an ongoing situation." "There's no ongoing situation," Eli said. "The air marshal cleared me 2 hours ago." Burke glanced at Harrison, who was standing 3 rows back with his arms folded across his chest. Then Burke turned back to Eli. "Captain Harrison has raised concerns about crew-passenger dynamics in this cabin, and I've been asked to mediate." "Mediate what exactly?" "The captain feels that the interaction earlier in the flight created an unsafe environment for the crew." Richard Park leaned into the aisle. "Unsafe for the crew. The crew is the party that initiated the confrontation. The crew is the party that attempted to illegally relocate a paying first-class passenger. The crew is the party that filed a false security report with the onboard air marshal. If anyone was unsafe on this flight, Mr. Burke, it was my client." Burke looked at Richard. "And you are Richard Park, attorney, representing Mr. Moore." Burke's face changed. The practiced neutrality crumbled just slightly, revealing the flicker of a man who had just realized he was standing in deeper water than he expected. "Mr. Park, I'm not here to assign blame. I'm here to ensure the remainder of this flight proceeds smoothly. Then I suggest you instruct Captain Harrison to remain in the cockpit and fly the plane, instruct Ms. Foster to perform her duties without discrimination, and leave my client alone for the remaining 4 hours of this flight. That would be smooth." Burke stood very still. Eli could see him calculating, measuring the gap between what Harrison had told him and what he was now seeing with his own eyes. A calm, composed passenger, a credentialed attorney, a situation that had clearly been misrepresented. "Mr. Moore," Burke said carefully, "I apologize for the disruption. I'm going to recommend to the captain that no further interventions are necessary for the duration of this flight." "Thank you," Eli said. "And Mr. Burke, when we land, I'd like a complete written report of every communication Captain Harrison made during this flight. Every intercom call to the cabin, every call to the ground, every log entry. I want all of it." Burke blinked. "Sir, I'm not sure I have the authority to provide that." "You don't, but I do. My name is Elias Moore. Marcus Moore was my father. I am the chairman and CEO of this airline, and I am giving you a direct order." The words landed at the cabin like stones dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward in every direction. Burke's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes went wide, then wider. He looked at Eli, at the hoodie, at the sneakers, at the face of a teenager who had just identified himself as the most powerful person in the room, on the plane, and in the entire company. "You're," Burke stopped. He swallowed. "You're Marcus Moore's son." "I am." "Sir, I had no idea. I was told there was a disruptive passenger. Captain Harrison said you were a threat." "Captain Harrison said a lot of things tonight. Most of them were lies. All of them will be documented. I need that report, Mr. Burke, and I need it before my legal team meets me at the gate in London." Burke nodded rapidly. His supervisor badge caught the overhead light as his chest moved up and down with quickened breathing. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. I'll have everything prepared." He turned and walked back toward the cockpit, passing Captain Harrison, who was still standing in the aisle with his arms crossed. Burke stopped beside Harrison and said something in a low voice. Eli couldn't hear the words, but he watched Harrison's face as Burke spoke. The color drained from it in stages like water receding from a shore. First the cheeks went pale, then the forehead. Then the lips pressed together so tight, they disappeared entirely. Harrison looked at Eli. For the first time since this flight began, there was no arrogance in his eyes, no contempt, no superiority. There was only the cold, dawning terror of a man who had just realized he had picked a fight with the one person on earth he could not afford to offend. Eli held his gaze. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Captain Michael Harrison and let the silence speak for itself. Harrison turned and walked back into the cockpit. The door closed behind him with a sound that felt to everyone listening very much like the end of something. Richard Park exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, "I think that went rather well." Eli picked up his phone. His hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, the kind that comes after you've done something irreversible, and you know in your bones that it was right. He texted Sarah. "They know who I am now. Burke is preparing the flight reports." Harrison looked like he saw a ghost. "We land in 4 hours. Sarah's reply came back instantly. "Good, because I just found out which board members Ashford has been talking to." Eli called Sarah back before Burke had even reached the cockpit door. "Which board members?" he said. No greeting, no preamble. Sarah didn't waste time either. 2. Raymond Kessler and Vivian Cho. Kessler's been on the board since year 3. He was one of your father's earliest investors. Vivian joined 5 years ago when we expanded into Asian markets. Both of them voted against Project Lighthouse. How do you know Ashford's been talking to them? Because Vivian Cho's assistant called our London office 30 minutes ago to request access to the confidential shareholder meeting minutes from the last 2 quarters. She didn't go through normal channels. She went directly to a junior analyst named Paul Barker, who happens to be her nephew. Paul called me because he didn't know what to do. I told him to stall. Eli pressed his phone harder against his ear. Shareholder meeting minutes. She's looking for vulnerabilities. She's looking for leverage. If Ashford is building a takeover case, he needs evidence that Global Skyways is underperforming or mismanaged. The minutes from the last 2 quarters include the board debate about Project Lighthouse, your father's health concerns that he shared confidentially with the directors, and the preliminary revenue projections that came in under target because of the fuel cost spikes last summer. All of which look terrible out of context. Exactly. Out of context, it looks like a sick CEO pushing through a controversial internal surveillance program while the company bleeds revenue. That's the story Ashford wants to tell. That's the story Kessler and Cho are helping him build. Eli was quiet. The engine noise filled the silence between them, steady and relentless. He thought about Raymond Kessler, a man who had sat at his father's dinner table, who had bounced a 7-year-old Eli on his knee, who had given a toast at Marcus's 50th birthday about loyalty and brotherhood and the bonds that business alone cannot create. That man was now feeding confidential company information to a competitor who wanted to tear Marcus Moore's legacy apart. Eli, you still there? I'm here. I'm just trying to figure out how someone my father trusted for 23 years could do this. Sarah's voice softened just slightly. Your father asked me the same question 3 weeks ago. He already suspected Kessler. He just couldn't prove it. He knew? He knew something was off. Kessler had been pushing for months to bring in an outside management consulting firm to review executive operations. Your father saw it for what it was, a Trojan horse. You bring in outside consultants, they produce a report that says the company needs restructuring, and suddenly there's a paper trail that justifies a merger. Your father blocked it. Kessler was furious. And Vivian. Vivian is harder to read. She's never been openly hostile, but she's been quietly building a relationship with Orion's board for at least a year. She attended a private dinner in Hong Kong last October that was hosted by Ashford's chief strategy officer. She told your father it was a coincidence. Your father didn't believe her, but he didn't confront her because he was still gathering evidence. Eli closed his eyes. His father had been fighting on so many fronts at once. The airline, the discrimination inside his own company, the board members who were plotting behind his back, the competitor circling like a shark, and through all of it, the heart condition that no one knew about until it killed him. Sarah, how much of this can we prove? The Kessler connection is circumstantial but strong. The Vivian connection is weaker, but the Hong Kong dinner and the shareholder minutes request give us enough to confront her. Here's the problem. If we move against both of them before the board meeting, we risk spooking the other directors. Some of them are neutral. Some of them might be sympathetic to Ashford without knowing the full picture. If we go in guns blazing and it looks like a purge, we lose the middle. So what do? We split them. Kessler is the bigger threat. He's been on the board the longest, he has the most relationships, and he's the one Ashford is using as his primary contact. If we neutralize Kessler, Vivian loses her cover. She's not a leader. She's an opportunist. Without Kessler backing her, she folds. How do we neutralize Kessler? That's what I've been working on for the last hour. Your father kept personal files on every board member, not official files, personal ones, notes, observations, things he noticed over the years. I found his file on Kessler. And Raymond Kessler has been using his position on the board to steer maintenance contracts toward a company called Meridian Technical Services. Meridian is a legitimate company, but it's owned by a shell corporation that traces back to a trust controlled by Kessler's brother-in-law. Your father documented 3 contracts over the last 5 years, totaling $47 million. He had the paper trail, he just never used it. Why not? Sarah paused. Because he still believed Kessler might come around. Your father was a lot of things, Eli, but he was never cynical about people. He always left the door open, even when he shouldn't have. Eli let that settle. His father's greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. The belief that people could be better than their worst choices. It was the same quality that had made Marcus Moore build an airline on the principle of equity, and it was the same quality that had allowed a man like Kessler to betray him from the inside for years. I'm not leaving the door open, Eli said. I didn't think you would. Prepare the Kessler file, everything. The Shell Corporation, the contracts, the money trail. Have Gerald Torres review it for legal exposure. If Kessler has been self-dealing through the board, that's not just a breach of fiduciary duty, it's fraud. It could be yes. Then we present it at the board meeting, not as an accusation, as evidence. We let the other directors see what Kessler has been doing, and we let them draw their own conclusions. And Vivian? We give Vivian a choice. She can either support the expansion of Project Lighthouse and vote to reject any partnership with Orion, or she can explain to the board why she was requesting confidential shareholder minutes through her nephew at 2 a.m. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Eli, I want you to understand something. What you're describing is a boardroom confrontation that would make most seasoned CEOs sweat. You've been chairman for 4 days. I've been chairman for 4 days. I've been Marcus Moore's son for 19 years. He taught me how to read people, Sarah. He taught me how to see what's really happening underneath what people say. And what's really happening is that Kessler and Cho and Ashford and Harrison and Karen Foster are all symptoms of the same disease. They all believed that because my father is gone, the rules don't apply anymore. They all thought they could take what they wanted because there was nobody left to stop them. And you're going to stop them. Every single one of them, starting with the 2 who are still on this plane. Eli hung up. He sat in the quiet cabin and let the weight of everything settle onto his shoulders. It was heavy, heavier than anything he had ever carried, but it wasn't crushing. It was the weight of responsibility, and his father had carried it for 26 years without flinching. Richard Park was awake now, watching Eli with the careful attention of a man who could read a room the way others read a book. Big call, he said. The biggest. Want to talk about it. Eli looked at Richard. In the last few hours, this man had gone from a stranger to a witness to an advocate. He had offered his card, his testimony, and his expertise without asking for anything in return. Eli had learned from his father that trust was the most expensive currency in business and also the most valuable. Raymond Kessler, Eli said. Do you know the name? Richard's eyes sharpened. Board member, Global Skyways, one of the original investors. I've seen his name in SEC filings. He's working with Victor Ashford at Orion Aviation to build a case for a hostile takeover. He's been steering maintenance contracts to a company owned by his brother-in-law. $47 million over 5 years. Richard let out a low whistle. That's not a conflict of interest. That's grand larceny in a three-piece suit. My father knew about it. He documented everything but never pulled the trigger. And you're going to pull it. Thursday morning, at the board meeting. Richard nodded slowly. You'll need that documentation airtight. If Kessler has any warning, he'll destroy evidence, resign before the meeting, and claim he was planning to leave anyway. You get one shot at this. I know. And you need to control the narrative. If Ashford gets to the press before you do, the story becomes teenager inherits airline, immediately starts firing board members. That plays right into the takeover narrative. That's what the press conference Friday is for. We tell the story our way. The discrimination on the flight, the cover-up by Holloway, the self-dealing by Kessler, the attempted takeover by Orion. All of it. One narrative, one message. Global Skyways is cleaning house and coming back stronger. Richard studied Eli for a long time. You know, when I got on this plane tonight, I thought the most interesting thing about this flight would be the new wine selection. I was very wrong. Eli almost smiled. He was getting better at almost smiling. It wasn't quite there yet, but the muscles were starting to remember how. The cockpit door opened. Eli tensed, expecting Harrison, expecting another confrontation. But it wasn't Harrison. It was Diane, and she was walking fast, her face tight with urgency. She stopped at Eli's row and knelt down beside his seat. Mr. Moore, I need to tell you something, and I don't have much time. What is it? Karen just got off the phone again. This time it wasn't Derek Holloway. She called someone on the ground in London. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard a name. Kessler. Eli went cold. Karen Foster is in contact with Raymond Kessler. I don't know the relationship. I just heard her say the name and then something about making sure the story was consistent. Those were her exact words. Making sure the story is consistent. Richard leaned into the aisle. They're coordinating their accounts. If Kessler is connected to Karen Foster, that means the discrimination on this flight isn't just a random incident. It's connected to the boardroom politics. Eli's mind was racing. Karen Foster, a senior flight attendant. Derek Holloway, her supervisor, who had been covering for her. Raymond Kessler, a board member funneling contracts to his family. All of them connected, all of them protecting each other. A web of corruption that stretched from the cabin of this aircraft to the boardroom of the company his father built. Diane, Eli said, "How does Karen Foster know a board member?" Diane hesitated. "I've worked with Karen for 3 years. She's never mentioned anyone on the board. But about 6 months ago, she started getting these calls, always from the same number. She always took them in private, always came back looking like she'd been given orders. The other attendants noticed. Nobody said anything because Karen is the kind of person you don't question. What kind of orders? I don't know specifics, but I know she started getting more aggressive with certain passengers. Not all passengers, specific ones. She'd single them out, provoke them, create incidents. One time about 4 months ago, she got a businessman so upset that he threatened to call the airline. She wrote him up for verbal abuse before he could file his own complaint. His complaint was dismissed. Her write-up went into his passenger file. Eli felt sick. She was manufacturing incidents. That's what it looked like. "Why, what's the purpose?" Richard answered before Diane could. "Insurance. If you're building a case that an airline has a hostile passenger problem, you need incidents. Real documented incidents. Complaints filed by crew, not by passengers. If Kessler is feeding Karen targets and Karen is creating paper trails, they're building a narrative that Global Skyways has a customer relations crisis. That's another piece of the takeover puzzle." Eli stared at Richard. They were sabotaging the airline from the inside. They were building the case to justify selling it. The realization hit Eli like a physical blow. His father's airline wasn't just being attacked from outside by Orion Aviation. It was being hollowed out from within by people Marcus had trusted, people he had hired, promoted, and defended. And his father had been fighting it alone with Project Lighthouse as his weapon, right up until his heart gave out in the middle of a boardroom. A terrible thought crossed Eli's mind. He pushed it away. Then it came back harder. "Sarah said my father collapsed during a quarterly earnings call," Eli said slowly. "A board meeting. Kessler was in that room." Richard looked at him. "Eli." My father had been under enormous stress. He was fighting Kessler, fighting the discrimination, fighting the takeover. He was doing it all himself because he didn't know who he could trust on his own board, and the stress killed him. You don't know that. I know that my father was healthy enough to work 18-hour days for 26 years. I know that the last 3 months of his life were consumed by a war he was fighting inside his own company. And I know that the people who were causing that war are still sitting in their offices, still drawing their salaries, and still trying to destroy everything he built. Diane put her hand on the armrest of Eli's seat. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but the warmth of it grounded him. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry about your father. And I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner about Karen. You're speaking up now. That's what matters." Diane nodded. She glanced over her shoulder. "I need to get back before Karen notices I'm gone. But Mr. Moore, whatever you're going to do, please do it. Not just for you, for all of us. For every crew member who's been afraid to say something. For every passenger who's been treated like they didn't belong." She stood and walked back toward the galley. Eli watched her go. Richard was already pulling out his phone. "I'm going to text my associate in London. She's the best corporate investigator I've ever worked with. If there's a documented connection between Karen Foster and Raymond Kessler, she'll find it. Do it." While Richard typed, Eli opened his phone and composed a message to Sarah. This one was longer than any he'd sent before. Sarah knew information. Karen Foster has been in direct contact with Raymond Kessler. Diane, the flight attendant who's been helping me, says Karen has been manufacturing passenger incidents for the last 6 months, possibly to build a false narrative about customer relations problems that would support the takeover bid. I need you to pull every crew incident report Karen Foster has filed in the last 12 months. Cross-reference them with the dates of Karen's calls to the number Diane mentioned. And I need you to check something else. The day my father collapsed. Was Kessler in the room? What happened in the minutes before the heart attack? Was there a confrontation? Sarah's response took longer this time. Almost 5 minutes. When it came, it was brief and devastating. Kessler was in the room. According to 3 witnesses, he and your father had a heated argument about Project Lighthouse immediately before the collapse. Kessler accused your father of creating a surveillance state within the company. Your father told Kessler he had evidence of financial misconduct on the board and that he intended to present it at the next meeting. Kessler told your father in front of the entire board that he was a paranoid old man who should have retired years ago. Your father stood up to respond. He never finished the sentence. Eli put his phone face down on his lap. He couldn't look at it anymore. He couldn't read those words again. His father had been standing up to defend his company, his principles, everything he believed in, and his heart had failed him in the middle of the fight. Kessler had watched Marcus Moore collapse. Kessler had been in the room when paramedics tried to save him. Kessler had probably offered condolences, probably shook Eli's hand at the funeral, probably looked him in the eye and said he was sorry for his loss. And the entire time Kessler had been working to dismantle everything Marcus died defending. Eli picked up his phone. He typed 1 sentence to Sarah. Kessler doesn't get a warning. He doesn't get a conversation. He gets served at the board meeting in front of everyone. Sarah replied, "Understood. Gerald is preparing the documents now. One more thing. I tracked down the 2 passengers who filed complaints against Captain Harrison, the ones Holloway dismissed. Their names are James Whitfield and Amara Okafor. Both were willing to talk. Both said they were humiliated. Both said the airline ignored them, and both said they gave up because they felt like nobody cared. I told them someone cares now." Eli closed his eyes. James Whitfield, Amara Okafor. Real people. Real pain. Ignored and discarded by a system that was supposed to protect them. His father had built Project Lighthouse to find people like them to make sure their voices were heard. And now Eli was going to make sure those voices were amplified so loud that no one in the industry could pretend they didn't hear. He opened a new message and typed carefully. Sarah, add James Whitfield and Amara Okafor to the Friday press conference. Not as exhibits, not as props, as speakers. Let them tell their stories in their own words, and make sure our legal team is ready to offer a full public apology and a settlement that reflects what this airline put them through. My father would have wanted that. I want that. Sarah's response was 2 words. Done, Chairman. Richard put his phone away and looked at Eli. My associate is on it. She'll have a preliminary report by the time we land. Thank you, Richard. Don't thank me yet. Thank me after Thursday. Eli nodded. He leaned back in his seat and looked up at the ceiling of the aircraft. Somewhere above him, beyond the metal and the insulation and the pressurized air stars, were burning in the dark. His father used to tell him that the stars were just distant suns, each one holding its own system together through nothing but gravity and persistence. Marcus would point up through the window during night flights and say, "That's what leadership is, Eli. You hold everything together not because it's easy, but because everything falls apart if you let go." Eli wasn't going to let go. The flight display showed they were 2 hours from London, 2 hours from the ground, from the legal team, from the board meeting that would determine the future of global skyways. 2 hours from the moment when Eli Moore, 19 years old, orphaned, exhausted, and burning with a fury so focused, it felt almost like calm would step off this plane and into a war his father had started and he intended to finish. Karen Foster walked through the cabin one more time, collecting empty glasses and folded blankets. She passed Eli's row without stopping, without looking, without acknowledging his existence. But her hands were shaking, and she pressed them against her sides to hide it. She had made her calls. She had coordinated her story. She had done everything she could think of to protect herself. She had no idea that every call had been logged, that every word had been flagged, that the system her own company had built was now the weapon that would end her career and expose the network she had served. She had no idea that the boy in 1A was no longer just a boy in 1A. He was the storm that was coming. The wheels hit the tarmac at Heathrow with a jolt that shook the entire cabin. Eli felt the impact in his chest, felt the reverse thrust press him forward against his seatbelt, and felt something else too, something he hadn't expected. Relief. Not because the flight was over, but because the waiting was over. Everything that happened next would be action, not endurance, and action was something Eli could control. The aircraft taxied toward the gate. Captain Harrison's voice came over the intercom one final time, thanking passengers for flying global skyways, wishing them a pleasant stay in London. His voice was steady, professional, betraying nothing. The voice of a man who had spent 32 years learning how to sound calm when everything underneath was collapsing. Eli unbuckled his seatbelt. Richard Park was already on his feet across the aisle, pulling his bag from the overhead bin. He caught Eli's eye and gave a single nod. No words needed. The cabin doors opened. First-class passengers filed out in the usual order, gathering bags, checking phones, stepping into the jet bridge with the mechanical efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times. Eli stood, pulled his carry-on from under the seat, and walked toward the door. Karen Foster was standing at the exit. It was standard procedure, the farewell position where flight attendants thanked each passenger as they deplaned. Karen stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her chin up, her smile locked in place like a mask bolted to bone. When the passenger ahead of Eli passed, Karen said, "Thank you for flying with us today." When Eli stepped in front of her, she said nothing. Eli stopped. He looked at her directly, holding her gaze long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. Karen's smile trembled at the edges. Her eyes darted sideways, then back. "Have a good day, Ms. Foster," Eli said. His voice was quiet, neutral, carrying no malice, just certainty. The certainty of a man who knew what was coming and felt no need to announce it. Karen's lips parted, but no sound came out. Eli walked past her and into the jet bridge. Sarah Jenkins was waiting at the gate. She was standing beside a man in a dark suit who Eli recognized from photographs as Gerald Torres, the company's general counsel. Behind them stood two more people Eli didn't know, a woman with a briefcase and a man holding a tablet. Sarah's face was composed, professional, but when she saw Eli, something broke through for just a moment. Her eyes softened. She took one step forward, then stopped herself, remembering where they were and who was watching. "Eli," she said, "welcome to London." "Sarah, how bad is it?" "Worse than I told you on the phone. Better than it's going to be for the people who caused it." She turned to Gerald. "Gerald, meet your new chairman." Gerald Torres extended his hand. His grip was firm, and his eyes were sharp, the eyes of a man who had spent decades navigating legal minefields and had learned to spot every tripwire before it tripped. "Mr. Moore, I've prepared a full briefing. We have a car waiting." "The briefing can wait until we're moving. First, tell me about the gate." Gerald glanced at Sarah, then back at Eli. "We have airport security standing by. Captain Harrison and Karen Foster have been instructed to remain on the aircraft pending an internal investigation." Derek Holloway has been contacted and informed that his presence is required at headquarters by end of business today. He tried to refuse. I told him the alternative was a suspension pending a formal inquiry. He's on his way. Good. And Kessler? Raymond Kessler is in London. He arrived yesterday. He's staying at the Langham, which is where the board meeting is scheduled for Thursday. He doesn't know we have the Meridian files. He will by Thursday morning. They walk through the terminal in formation, Sarah on Eli's left, Gerald on his right, the two associates trailing behind. Eli's sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, and he was suddenly aware of how he must look. A kid in a hoodie surrounded by suits. The same image that had made Karen Foster dismiss him 9 hours ago. The same image that would make Raymond Kessler underestimate him in 48 hours. Good. Let them underestimate him. His father had built an empire while people underestimated him. It was practically a family tradition. The car was a black sedan with tinted windows. Eli climbed in and Sarah handed him a tablet. On the screen was a document labeled Project Lighthouse Incident Report, Flight 110. Read it, Sarah said. Every interaction logged, every call Karen made from the galley phone, every intercom communication between Harrison and ground operations. Project Lighthouse captured all of it. Eli scrolled through the report. It was meticulous time-stamped entries documenting Karen's initial confrontation. Harrison's intervention, the false air marshal report, the call to Holloway, the call to Kessler. Each entry was tagged with a category: racial profiling, abuse of authority, fraudulent security report, coordinated cover-up. My father built this system, Eli said quietly. He built it because he knew this was happening, and he knew nobody would believe it without proof. He was right. Eli closed the report and looked at Sarah. What about James Whitfield and Amara Okafor? Sarah's expression shifted, warmer, softer. James Whitfield is a retired schoolteacher from Baltimore. He flew global skyways to Accra 3 years ago to visit family. Captain Harrison humiliated him in front of the entire first-class cabin, told him he must have accidentally wandered out of economy. James filed a complaint. Holloway dismissed it in 2 weeks. James told me he cried when I called him. He said he thought nobody at the airline cared. And Amara Okafor is a surgeon, pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon at Johns Hopkins. She was flying to a medical conference in Frankfurt 18 months ago. Harrison refused to believe her ticket was legitimate. He made her show her medical credentials before he'd let her stay in her seat. She filed a complaint and received a form letter saying the matter had been reviewed and no action was warranted. She said she never flew global skyways again. A heart surgeon, Eli said. Harrison made a heart surgeon prove she deserved her seat. Both of them have agreed to speak at the press conference. Both of them cried when I told them what happened to you on Flight 110, and both of them asked me to tell you that your father would be proud. Eli pressed his forehead against the car window. London was gray and wet outside, the kind of morning that felt like the sky itself was holding its breath. He thought about his father standing up in that boardroom, standing up to Kessler, standing up for everything he believed in. He thought about Marcus never finishing that sentence. Eli was going to finish it for him. Thursday morning arrived faster than it should have. Eli slept for 9 hours at the hotel, the first real sleep he'd had since his father died, and woke up feeling something he hadn't felt in days. Clarity. He showered, dressed in the suit Sarah had arranged for him, a navy blue two-piece that fit like it had been waiting for him, and looked at himself in the mirror. He didn't see a kid in a hoodie anymore. He didn't see a fraud. He saw a young man who had been tested at 35,000 feet and hadn't broken. The boardroom was on the 42nd floor of Global Skyways London headquarters. 12 chairs around a long table. 11 of them occupied when Eli walked in at exactly 9 o'clock. Sarah was on his right, Gerald Torres on his left. Richard Park sat in the back of the room as an observer at Eli's personal invitation. The directors looked up when Eli entered, some with curiosity, some with skepticism, two with something closer to fear. Raymond Kessler was sitting at the far end of the table. He was a large man, silver-haired, tanned, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He looked at Eli the way Harrison had looked at him on the plane, the look that said, "You don't belong here." Vivian Cho was seated to Kessler's right. She was smaller, sharper, her expression carefully neutral. She held a pen between her fingers, rolling it back and forth with the restless energy of someone who knew something was coming, but not what. Eli sat down. He didn't wait for introductions. He didn't wait for pleasantries. He opened his laptop, connected it to the room's display screen, and said, 6 days ago, my father died in this room. He died standing up. He died in the middle of a sentence. I'm here to finish that sentence. The room went silent. My father built this airline from nothing. He built it on the principle that every person who steps onto one of our aircraft deserves to be treated with dignity. 6 days ago, I boarded Global Skyways Flight 110, and the crew of that aircraft violated every principle my father stood for. I was racially profiled, harassed, denied service, and subjected to a false security report. And when I investigated why, I discovered that the discrimination on that flight was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a systemic failure that extends from the cabin to this boardroom. Kessler shifted in his seat. Eli, this is hardly the forum for personal grievances. If you had an issue on a flight, there are proper channels. The proper channels are the ones that dismissed 2 prior complaints against the same Captain Raymond, dismissed by Derek Holloway, who reports to you. The color drained from Kessler's face so fast it was almost theatrical. Holloway doesn't report to me. He reports to the VP of Operations. He reports to the VP of Operations, who reports to the board's Operations Committee, which you chair. You signed off on Holloway's performance reviews for the last 6 years. You recommended his promotion, and you took his call at 1 a.m. London time when Karen Foster contacted him from Flight 110, asking for help covering up what she did to me. Gerald Torres stood and distributed a folder to each board member. Inside was the Meridian file. Contracts, Shell Corporation documents, bank records, the complete paper trail connecting Raymond Kessler to $47 million in fraudulently directed maintenance contracts. What is this? One of the directors asked, flipping through the pages. That, Eli said, is evidence that Raymond Kessler has been steering company contracts to a firm owned by his brother-in-law for the past 5 years. $47 million. My father documented every transaction. He was building this case when he died. Kessler slammed his palm on the table. This is outrageous. You're a child. You've been chairman for less than a week, and you're accusing me of fraud based on the paranoid fantasies of a man who was clearly losing his grip on reality. The room gasped, not loudly, not dramatically, but the intake of breath from 11 people at the same time created a sound that was impossible to miss. Kessler had just called Marcus Moore, the founder of the company, the man whose death they were still mourning, paranoid and delusional, in his own boardroom, in front of his son. Eli didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at Kessler with the same steady gaze he had used on Captain Harrison at 35,000 feet, and he said, "My father was many things. Paranoid was not one of them. The documents in front of you are not fantasies. They are bank records, corporate filings, and contract agreements. They have been reviewed by our general counsel and verified independently. If you believe they are fabricated, you are welcome to challenge them in court. I suspect you won't." Kessler opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked around the table, searching for allies, searching for the support he had spent years cultivating. He found none. The other directors were reading the Meridian file, and the expressions on their faces told the story. Shock, disgust, betrayal. Eli turned to Vivian Cho. "Vivian, I know about the dinner in Hong Kong last October. I know about the call your assistant made requesting confidential shareholder minutes through your nephew, Paul Barker. And I know about your communications with Orion Aviation's chief strategy officer regarding a potential merger." Vivian's pen stopped rolling. She set it down on the table with exaggerated care, as though the pen itself might detonate if handled roughly. "Eli, I can explain." "I'm sure you can, but I'd rather you choose. Right now, in front of this board, you can either commit to supporting the full expansion of Project Lighthouse and vote to reject any partnership with Orion Aviation, or you can resign. Those are your options. You can't give me an ultimatum. The board votes collectively. The board votes collectively on policy. The chairman decides who sits at this table. My father's will gives me full executive authority. Gerald, please confirm." Gerald Torres didn't hesitate. "Confirmed. The will grants Mr. Moore complete authority over board composition, executive appointments, and company operations, effective immediately upon succession." Vivian Cho looked at Kessler. Kessler was staring at the table, his face the color of old ash. He had nothing left to offer her. No protection, no cover, no escape route. "I'll support Project Lighthouse," Vivian said quietly, "and I vote to reject Orion's proposal." "Thank you, Vivian." Eli turned back to Kessler. "Raymond, your position on this board is terminated effective immediately. Your access to company systems, facilities, and communications will be revoked within the hour. Our legal team will be filing a formal complaint with the SEC regarding the Meridian contracts. You will receive a copy of the filing by end of business today." Kessler stood up. His chair rolled backward and hit the wall. He pointed a trembling finger at Eli. "Your father would never have done this. He had too much class, too much loyalty. My father had too much loyalty. That's why you were able to steal from him for 5 years. I don't have that problem." Kessler grabbed his briefcase, turned, and walked out of the boardroom. The door closed behind him and nobody spoke for a very long time. Eli looked around this table. "Does anyone else want to leave?" Silence. "Good. Then let's talk about the future of this company." The board meeting lasted 3 more hours. Eli presented the expansion of Project Lighthouse, now renamed the Marcus Moore Accountability Initiative, as a permanent company-wide system for tracking and addressing discrimination at every level of operations. The vote was unanimous. He announced the termination of Captain Michael Harrison and Senior Flight Attendant Karen Foster, along with the suspension of Derek Holloway, pending a full investigation. He introduced new protocols for handling passenger complaints, including independent review boards that bypassed regional supervisors entirely. And he announced that Global Skyways would be making a public commitment to equity and accountability at a press conference the following morning. When the meeting ended, the directors filed out quietly. Several stopped to shake Eli's hand. One of them, an older woman named Margaret Chen, who had served on the board since the airline's early days, took Eli's hand in both of hers and held it. "Your father sat in that exact chair," she said. "He would have been so proud of what you did today. So proud." Eli thanked her. He waited until the room was empty, until Sarah and Gerald and Richard had stepped outside, until he was completely alone. Then he sat down in his father's chair, put his head in his hands, and cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from weakness, the kind that comes from carrying something impossibly heavy for 6 days and finally being allowed to set it down. The press conference the next morning was standing room only. International media, aviation industry reporters, civil rights organizations. The story had already leaked, fragments and rumors spreading through social media overnight, but the full picture was still Eli's to tell. He stood at the podium in his Navy suit, no notes, no teleprompter, and spoke for 22 minutes. He told the story of Flight 110. He told the story of James Whitfield, who stood at the microphone with tears running down his face and described what it felt like to be told he didn't belong in his own seat. He told the story of Amara Okafor, who spoke with the controlled precision of a surgeon and the raw emotion of a woman who had been waiting 18 months for someone to listen. Eli announced the Marcus Moore Accountability Initiative. He announced the termination of employees involved in discrimination and cover-ups. He announced the filing against Raymond Kessler. And he made a promise. "My father built Global Skyways because he believed the sky belongs to everyone. Not just the powerful, not just the wealthy, not just the people who look like what some flight attendant thinks a first-class passenger should look like. Everyone." That promise was broken on Flight 110. It was broken by people my father trusted. It was broken under the name of the company he built with his own hands. And I am standing here today to tell you that it will never be broken again. Not on my watch, not on any flight, not in any boardroom, not ever. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But Eli didn't hear any of it. He was looking at the back of the room where Diane, the flight attendant, who had refused Karen Foster's order, who had warned him about the air marshal, who had knelt beside his seat and told him the truth when staying silent would have been safer, was standing against the wall with tears in her eyes and both hands pressed over her mouth. Eli caught her eye and nodded. She nodded back. That afternoon, Eli returned to the Global Skyways headquarters. Sarah was waiting in the lobby with a folder. Orion Aviation withdrew their takeover interest an hour ago, she said. Victor Ashford released a statement saying, and I quote, that this is not the right time for industry consolidation. Translation, he doesn't want to be anywhere near this story. Exactly. What about Harrison and Foster? Harrison's pilot license is under review by the FAA. Foster has been terminated and is under investigation by our legal team. Holloway resigned 30 minutes ago. He didn't even wait for the inquiry. Good. Sarah handed him the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten letter scanned and printed. The handwriting was his father's. Eli, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're sitting in my chair. I know you're scared. I was scared too. Every single day. But here's the thing, I never told you being scared is fine. Being scared means you understand how much is at stake. The people who aren't scared are the dangerous ones. They don't feel the weight, so they don't protect it. You are going to make mistakes. Make them loudly. Learn from them fast. Trust Sarah. She's smarter than both of us. Trust yourself. You're readier than you think. The sky belongs to everyone, Eli. Protect it. Love. Dad. Eli folded the letter carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his suit jacket against his chest, where he could feel the paper against his heartbeat. He walked to the window of his father's office and looked out over London. Planes were taking off in the distance, one after another, rising into the gray sky and disappearing into the clouds. Each one carrying hundreds of people to hundreds of places, people who trusted that they would be treated with dignity from the moment they boarded to the moment they arrived. That trust was his responsibility now. Eli Moore, 19 years old chairman and CEO of Global Skyways, the son of a man who had changed an industry and the heir to a promise that had almost been destroyed, stood at that window and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not just protect his father's legacy. He would build it higher than Marcus Moore ever dreamed, because the sky has no ceiling and neither did the boy who refused to give up his seat.